Primetime Politics, weapons fire.
This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
Israel launches a preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear targets, setting off a military response from Tehran with a threat of severe punishment. Coming up, we'll examine what Israel is trying to accomplish with its military operation and the risk it carries for a wider regional conflict. Also, we'll examine the impact the Israeli strike will have on the upcoming meeting of the G7. The Ottawa bureau chiefs are standing by. Plus, is the United States slipping into authoritarianism? This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. In the last 24 hours, the world has witnessed a dramatic escalation in Middle East military action. It started Thursday night when Israel carried out a series of coordinated attacks, hitting Iranian nuclear sites and killing top military commanders in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. For Israel, it is a preemptive action meant to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. But for its part, Iran condemned the Israeli attack and responded with its own weapons fire, launching missiles and drones into Israel, some breaking through Israel's so-called Iron Dome and hitting civilian areas inside Tel Aviv. Well, to talk about what is happening, happy to have on the program this evening Christian Leuprecht, of course, strategy expert, professor of political science at the Royal Military College, as well as Queen's University. Christian, always happy to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Michael.
So this attack happens, Iran retaliates. Israel says this is going to be a 14-day campaign, but could go longer, rather. What's the goal here? Because, you know, yes, it is to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, but can that really be accomplished in the time frame that Israel is quoting?
No. And Israel has already come out and said that it is not able to take out all of Iran's nuclear capacities. It, of course, can slow down the ability of Iran to develop its program, and ostensibly that's the purpose of the strike. But I think what's going on here is actually something else. That we know that, of course, the U.S. and Iran have been negotiating an agreement, and we know that the outlines of that agreement look surprisingly similar to the agreement that the Trump administration tore up in 2018. So is Trump really going to go in front of the international media and announce an agreement that looks kind of like the one that he tore up? Or is this an opportunity sort of for Trump to force Iran into concessions and into real concessions that Iran has been unwilling to make? And from an Israeli perspective, Israel and Netanyahu in particular didn't want Iran and the U.S. to get an agreement, let alone something that's similar to 2018, because Israel at the time already felt that this agreement did not meet its objectives and its interests. So yes, it's Israel sort of doing the dirty work in return to lay the groundwork for Iran possibly to make some concessions. But of course, this is a massive gamble, and the possibilities for miscalculation are huge.
Yeah, and you know, and to what you just said, we know, for example, Donald Trump has already come out and said that Iran should take this opportunity to make a deal. We know as well that the United States knew that this strike was going to happen. But as you said, a great gamble here. What is the risk of this becoming a wider regional conflict?
Well, Israel itself is trying to control that risk. So if you look, it was very surgical at what and who it targeted. So it targeted the senior leadership of the nuclear program, and it targeted the senior military leadership. In particular, it targeted senior leadership of the Revolutionary Republican Guard Corps. Because it controls the elite units within the Iranian military, in particular those units who would be retaliating and planning that retaliation, but it also owns the nuclear program. And in addition to that, we know Israel targeted a senior meeting of Air Force commanders. So it really makes it much more difficult for Iran to retaliate. And of course, Israel took out a bunch of missile sites and air defense capabilities. But it left the political and the religious leadership intact. It appears not to have targeted a single person there. And so this is really a signal to Iran that you have an opportunity to make the right decision. And it's not that Israel would just be able to get Iran to sort of change course all of a sudden. But I think The challenge for Iran is really its own population, because if Iranians sense weakness in the regime, there's a high risk they'll go on the street and they might actually generate a revolution. And there's nothing that regimes that came to power through a revolution that fear more than their own people, because they know exactly what could happen. And so if the regime senses weakness domestically, I think to save itself existentially, it might be willing to sit down with the Americans and possibly cut some sort of a deal. And that might then be acceptable to Israel.
You know, I obviously the United States is Israel's strongest ally, but I'm wondering regionally, does Israel have any regional allies in this fight? Because, you know, as we talk about the gamble here, that has to be part of the calculation here, how other countries in the region might respond.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as saying ally, but I might say sympathizers. And of course, they're the same sympathizers that have been surprisingly quiet about Israel's conduct, including its conduct with regards to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that are the regimes that are now surprisingly quiet about Israel's attack on Iran. And that's, of course, all the Arab states in the neighborhood, because those Arab states have no love lost for Hamas and Hezbollah. And so Israel has effectively been doing their dirty work. And they, of course, have no love lost for Iran. And they sure don't want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon or want to avoid it as much as Israel does, only they don't have the capabilities, intelligence-wise and military-wise, that Israel does. So there's certainly some sympathies within the region. And of course, there's also sympathies internationally, because, of course, the same countries that only last week that came out and criticized Israel for its humanitarian conduct in Gaza, and then this week came out and sanctioned a couple of members of Netanyahu's cabinet, now all of a sudden find themselves lining up behind Israel and sort of tacitly saying, well, we sort of support Israel in its strike on Iran, because, of course, nobody in the West has an interest in having sort of another North Korea on their hands when it comes to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. So, so Israel certainly does have support. The question is, how long can it sustain that support? And of course, Netanyahu, being very Machiavellian, the Machiavellian politician that he is and the survivor that he is also using this occasion, of course, to distract from all the criticism and the humanitarian calamity and disaster that's going on in Gaza, so that he can continue to pursue his political and military objectives in Gaza, but less under the gaze of the international community.
And as you say, a big gamble, as there are many parts to this whole story. But listen, Christian, always appreciate you walking us through and helping us understand it better than we do. Christian Leuprecht, thank you for the time this evening.
Thanks for the conversation, Michael.
Well, of course, we are at the end of the week, and that means it is time for the Ottawa Bureau Chiefs. Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for LaPresse. Hello to all three of you.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so we've been gearing up for the G7 meeting that essentially kicks off on Sunday in Kananaskis. But obviously, we now have this event between Israel and Iran. Is that going to throw off the agenda? Will it derail the agenda at the G7, Bob?
That's a really good question, and I can't answer it. But I think it's going to have a huge impact on what the leaders are going to be dealing with, because as we speak, we know that Iran is targeting Israel at this very moment. So I think it's going to have a big impact on the whole G7 summit. I can't predict what is going to be, because we don't know what's going to unfold over the next few days, right? But even just leaving all that aside, the actual G7 agenda is going to be more important with the bilaterals. You know, all these leaders want to get a chance to get together with Donald Trump. They all have their own agendas. So I think from journalists who are going to be covering this is less that what the outcome of the G7 is going to be than these bilateral meetings with all of the leaders who are going to not only meet with Prime Minister Carney, and that I think is going to be important for us as well, but it's what everybody who gets the chance to talk to Donald Trump and comes out of those meetings that are going to set the agenda. And all of that, nobody has a clue, because, who can predict what Donald Trump's going to say, right?
I mean, I'll believe he's there when I see his plane take off from D.C. and actually, and his motorcade arrive in Kananaskis. Like, I really think, though, that it does influence, to a great extent, a bit of their talks, right? Previous to the eruption of violence last night, there was one working session, one working breakfast devoted to Ukraine and NATO, and then there was another session on global security. But I think that they can't escape dealing with this. It's a very precarious time for the globe. And so I think it rises up to the top of a multilateral agenda, if not all the bilateral discussions among some of the key players. But yeah, every G7 summit matters not just for who's coming and who's Zooming who in the hallway, but it also matters for the moment it's held in, and this is a particularly fraught one, I'd say. And so I can't believe that they won't be compelled to come out with some kind of statement on the need for de-escalation in the Middle East, and some kind of, even though that wasn't the plan, trying to avoid disruptions with Trump, to come out with a joint statement. They've got to somehow commit to a unified stance in resolving this crisis.
Yeah, although I wonder if it becomes a G6+1, since Donald Trump today, of course, saying that what's happening here really should speed up Iran making a deal, some type of nuclear deal, rather than calling for de-escalation.
G7 summits are usually about the economy, and everybody thought it's going to focus a lot on Trump and tariffs, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of that is going to be dealing with that now, simply because this is so unpredictable what's going on right now.
Carney's agenda, actually, though, was focused on a whole bunch of topics already at the outset to avoid exactly that clashes with Trump. So there's global economic security, there's energy, there's emerging technologies, AI, quantum computing. They're very devoted to dealing and doing deep dives down into those issues as well. So we'll see. But I think that really it is the biggest, the most juicy stuff is going to be who's talking to who and what comes out of those bilateral talks.
Yeah, but then throwing this other ball into the juggle, though, which is now what's happening between Israel and Iran.
Absolutely, and it's not going to be the first summit that is influenced by international events like this. Let's remember when Russia invaded Crimea, in the territory of Ukraine. Russia was expelled later from the summit of the G7 that was at that time G8, and then it became G7. And Mr. Carney has made the point of inviting a lot of international leaders to that summit that are not part of the G7, namely Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to discuss what can be done to ensure there is some more security talks or peace talks with Ukraine. Now, I think this will have to be added to the table. And as Tonda mentioned, there's no plan to have a final communique agreed upon by all the leaders. There might be a push now to have something more common on that front, because if the Middle East erupt, the Middle East erupt into a full war, that's going to be more dangerous for the whole planet.
Yeah, but still, as we said, unpredictable, because it's hard to know where the United States gets.
It's also going to be fascinating for us to watch. Carney's a serious guy. He's got an agenda, he's got a vision, and we're all, as journalists, are going to watch this. This is the first time he's going to have all these world leaders together, and we're going to have an opportunity to see how he performs. I mean, we don't know how he's going to perform. We're all going to watch. We know that he's done excellent work when he was the Bank of Canada, Bank of England governor, and all of these other kind of forums, but this is the first time you're going to see him perform as a Prime Minister at a major group of leaders, more than G7, because we've got a whole lot of other leaders, and it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Well, let me jump on that, because I do wonder about what image, what message the Prime Minister is trying to convey here, because you all alluded to it, but when you look at the guest list here, it's more than just the member states of the G7. We're talking about the Secretary General of NATO, we're talking about Volodymyr Zelensky, we're talking about, controversially, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. But what is Mark Carney trying to accomplish with this meeting? Because it is a meeting of global leaders beyond the G7.
Yeah, and I think that there are multi-pronged goals of his in inviting using those various leaders for different parts of the conversations. Obviously, Zelensky is very much there for his concern around the resolution of the war there and how it gets led. Is it a U.S.-led negotiation, or do they have a say in it? And is any ceasefire or any agreement going to be enforceable? That's a very focused discussion. But a lot of those other countries, if you notice, either they are leading other international summits this year, important ones like the UN Conference on Climate Change, the next one, or the G20 in the case of South Africa. But there is also an attempt, I think, to bring together middle powers from different global regions who want to say in how the big powers deal with some of the problems that affect them. But there's also you know, Carney said it in his speech on defense earlier this week. You know, he talked about the difficult sort of time for the rules-based order in the world right now, and talking about forging partnerships with like-minded countries, you know, along different lines. And I think he's got that goal as well. I think he's trying to solidify different alliances, and we'll see if he succeeds. But I think that the number of countries, it's very common. G7 hosts often invite other country leaders. Famously in Italy, you know, Berlusconi had invited Muammar Gaddafi, and he came with tents and camels and everything. But I think, you know, Carney has very carefully picked people, country leaders who have roles in conflicts that are perhaps not necessarily understood more broadly. But the UAE and Saudi Arabia, had he come, they have a very key role to play in the resolution of the Middle East conflict. So I think that's what you're seeing there.
And those two countries also have a lot of investment in intelligence, artificial intelligence. Clearly, Mr. Carney wants to tackle a lot of global issues at that summit. So for his first steps as the chairman of the G7, but also on international scene, welcoming those leaders, I think he's got high ambitions. And in a very interesting way, tomorrow he will be meeting the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Keir Starmer, who's coming to Ottawa to meet the meeting. And so that, I think, is probably to make sure that Canada and Great Britain play the same cards at the same time, so that they can push together their agenda. And we'll see whether Mr. Carney will have also a meeting with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, with whom he met soon after he became prime minister. He knows quite well, Tonda and I, with her during that trip. So he knows how to play his card to try to create alliances with Canada that can push the Canadian interests further.
Yeah, you know, they're all talking to each other already, right? Britain, France, and Germany were talking today. Britain talked to Trump this afternoon. They're all already working the phones and building the basis for the conversations face-to-face next week. Okay, so very quickly, literally 20 seconds for you. What are you watching out for when it comes to the G7 as it starts next week, Bob?
Well, how does the Prime Minister handle Donald Trump? It was a disaster the last time we had a G7 thing in Charleroi, where it blew up on Justin Trudeau. So he's got to manage him really well. And how does he deal with the geopolitical threats that are facing the country? And this has just been thrown on his lap now. Yeah. How does he deal with Iran and Israel? We don't know.
No, same. I mean, those are the big key things that we've all got to watch next week. And I mean, you know, I get that he was very deft in sort of trying to avoid conflict by taking a joint statement off the table at the outset. But I still think that what I heard from every G7 country this week was that unity of purpose is really important coming out of the G7. And so how does that get reflected? Yeah.
Clearly, Mr. Carney wants to put his stamp on the international relationship of Canada, the foreign affairs policy of Canada, but with that summit. I'll be watching also whether Canada and the United States can get an agreement on abolishing the tariffs. There's been talk that there might be an exchange of documents between the two capitals that may achieve that. We'll see. As Bob mentioned so forcefully, Mr. Trump is a very unpredictable man. We don't know what we can expect from him, but that's going to be something I'll be watching.
Yeah, unpredictable even before what took place between Israel and Iran. Now a greater level of unpredictability. Somber times. Listen, Bob, Tonda,
thank you.
Joël-Denis, thank you very much.
Thanks. Have a good weekend.
You too. Well, to the United States now, where residents of Los Angeles and Washington are bracing for two very different events. In LA, the U.S. National Guard and U.S. Marines continue their deployment, keeping demonstrators away from immigration officers who have been raiding workplaces in Southern California looking for illegal migrants. At least a dozen groups are planning to hold rallies in Los Angeles on Saturday to protest both the military and immigration actions. Meanwhile, in D.C., there is an event being planned of a very different sort, a military parade through the city to mark the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army, also coinciding with Donald Trump's birthday. The president, by the way, has been the biggest proponent for this parade.
I don't think we've ever seen the likes of what you're going to see. I hope the weather's okay, but actually if it's not, that brings you good luck. And that's okay too. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the tanks at all. It doesn't affect the soldiers. They're used to it. They're tough.
Well, to talk about the situation in Los Angeles and this weekend's planned parade in D.C., we're now joined by Marci Shore, Professor of History with the Munk School of Global Affairs in Toronto, formerly of Yale University. Professor Shore, very nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So a little bit of your personal story for people at home, because you made the decision to relocate from Yale to the U of T, and part of that decision was motivated by the Trump administration's actions in the United States. Not a sudden decision, we should point out. It sounds like it was a gradual decision for you and your family. But what was bothering you, south of our border that made you consider coming to Canada?
Well, first of all, Canada is a very desirable place unto itself. It's not such an actual radical decision to come to Canada. I had studied at U of T as an MA student in the 1990s, and I was quite nostalgic about it. But of the various structural factors in the States that had long been contributing to a feeling that I might want to get my kids out of there, there's the gun violence, there's the absence of gun control laws, there is the creeping authoritarianism, and I knew my impulse was to get out immediately in 2016, the day after the elections, because I'm a neurotic Jew, and I thought the lesson of 33 is you get out sooner rather than later. And I ended up really feeling in 2016, much more than I had anticipated, a sense of moral obligation to stay and work with the students and help them process what was going on. And this time I knew it was going to be much worse. That said, I do feel quite guilty, about having, let's call it, escaped to Toronto, which is a beautiful place.
And, I've heard several Americans talk about that. But you yourself are a historian who specializes in totalitarianism. And you talk about the creeping authoritarianism in the United States. Certainly we've seen the attack on the courts, the attack on the media, the attack on universities in the U.S. What then do you make of this past week with the National Guard moving into Los Angeles and now this planned military parade through the streets of Washington?
Nothing has really been a surprise, I would say. All of these elements that Trump is drawing on, whether it be arbitrarily arresting people and deporting them, or using racist, sexist, vulgar language, or deciding that he is this godlike leader and everything he should say should go, or provoking violence of one group against another group. These are all elements that in various combinations we have seen before over and over again. So the idea that that Trump would decide to usurp his authority and send in the National Guard, and then even more radically, the Marines, which is really a military force designed for foreign combat, and not for domestic use, is not surprising. These are the kinds of things that aspiring dictators do, and one of the things they like to do is incite a situation of violence, which then becomes a pretext for a crackdown, a suspension of rights, a potential declaration of martial law. These are all things that, again, always in a slightly different combination, but we see them come up again and again.
So is the United States still a democracy? Because, I've heard certain politicians, certain political thought leaders question whether or not the U.S. still can qualify as a democracy.
I think that's certainly very debatable. I feel like we're way into, something I would call fascism or authoritarianism. I would also caution everybody that all of these concepts we use, we should not fetishize. All of these concepts, be they democracy, authoritarianism, fascism, concentration camps, they are categories and concepts that allow us to mediate between the singular and the universal. And they allow us to compare various historical phenomena, each one of which is always going to be different, but which will have certain things in common. I think certainly, democratic safety guards have broken down, what Americans cling to and have long believed in as a system of checks and balances have been eroded. And that doesn't happen overnight. That happens step by step. It always happens step by step. The Supreme Court ruling this past summer granting widespread presidential immunity, and keeping Trump free of prosecution for all sorts of things he should have been prosecuted for, including inciting a violent insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th and, encouraging a mob to hang his vice president. He got a blanket immunity for him. That was a green light, and now it's not that the courts have not been doing what the courts are supposed to do. It's that they take somebody like Mahmoud Khalil off the street, they send him into a prison for no reason, and the lawyers in the court say, well, you have to bring him back. And the administration says no. And then what happens? Then what happens when the executive branch is not respecting the division of power? Then it's a question of, is somebody going to use violence to stop that?
Mm-hmm. So what do you say then to people who hear your concerns about what's happening in the United States? And again, you use the term creeping authoritarianism. What do you say to people who describe you as being nothing more than an alarmist?
I understand that, first of all, I'm a historian of Eastern Europe. Anyone who studies East European history knows that things can look normal, but they can turn on a dime. So my neurotic catastrophism, as somebody who is a historian of Nazism and Stalinism, is perhaps overdetermined. That said, I feel like the present moment could easily be subtitled, Vindication of the Neurotic Catastrophist. And it's a problem people have of not being able to process what they are seeing in front of their eyes in real time. I have given dozens of interviews to European journalists who are asking me things like, but this couldn't really be happening in America. I mean, surely it's not really what it seems to be in America. And really, isn't it possible that the Trump administration is really trying to protect Jewish students from anti-Semitism? And I feel like you tell me, you're looking at the same things I'm seeing. I have no secret knowledge that you don't have. We're all looking at things that we just saw yesterday, how a Democratic senator attempting to ask a question of the Secretary of Homeland Security at a press conference was wrestled to the ground, pinned, and handcuffed. That is an unprecedented situation. We're watching all this in front of us, but there's a kind of Freudian denial that kicks in, that people can't quite process what's happening.
Marci Shore, a lot to think about. Thank you for sharing the time with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Friday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back next week. Until then, have a great weekend.